Hey, good morning there. You got Craig Davidson here of Taurus Agricultural Marketing, and we are pleased to have Cory Willness here as well this morning from CropPro Consulting out of Nacum, Saskatchewan. Say hi, Cory.
Good morning.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for coming on this morning and being a part of our Taurus Agronomic Bites podcast. It's been, I think, 5 weeks or 6 weeks since we had our last one. And today we got just two of us. And, obviously our conversation today is around salinity and alkalinity and the issues that we face in agricultural production here in Western Canada. But in all reality, I mean, this topic is really a world conversation issue in the production of agriculture. And so for us, we're going to shed more light on what we deal with here inside of our businesses and how we are trying to tackle it, even though it's a world issue and we have lots of world expertise. We're going to try to bring it down to what we see and what we deal with here in our market in Western Canada. Maybe Cory, to start, tell us a little bit about yourself and your business and some of the history that you have here in agriculture.
Sure. I was raised on a farm in northern Saskatchewan, cattle and grain. Got my degree at the U of S in 1996. I was an ag retail agronomist here locally in Nacum for 8 years. So got to work with all the local farmers, got to know the local area and fertilizer products and weeds and so on. And then I started my own consulting company in 2003. Wasn't too many of us back in the day. It was kind of a high risk thing. And so CropPro Consulting in 2003 was mostly just agronomic services for farmers, generally full farm type services. And then in 2008, we started offering variable rate fertilizer and seed with our swap maps technology. And 2014, we started an ag tech company called CropTomistic, which has 5 software developers, and we develop software and hardware, crop records, swap box, and the swap maps technology that is being used across the, North America and internationally. And now CropPro has 26 staff, mostly serving Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta.
Yeah. Right on. It's kind of funny. I mean, I always say this agricultural world is a small world we live in because I got to know and meet Cory back in the late 90s. I was living in Saskatoon at the time, working for a fertilizer company, and Cory was in the ag retail space as an agronomist. And so here we are over 20 years later, doing a podcast together. So again, thanks for coming on, and I'm going to enjoy this conversation and learn along with everybody else here this morning as we talk about this issue. So with your business, Cory, CropPro Consulting, obviously being in operation for 17 years or 18 years now, obviously your goal has been to define variability in the production of agriculture at the field level. Over those years, and I guess I'm assuming over the course of hundreds of thousands and into the millions of acres mapped today with your SWOT map process, is it fair to say that every single field that you touch is dealing with some background level of variability?
Yeah, variability for sure. I guess I thought you were going to say salinity, and then I was starting to think about what percentage would have salinity. But yeah, obviously every field has variability, and there's always this, idea that people think that they don't have variability. But even if you go into the really flat land and stuff like that, Regina Plains and the Red River Valley, that those people have had like a lot of wind erosion, and that shows up on their EC maps. And of course, I always say water always sits somewhere. So whether you're in flat land or pothole land, and it's wet out, a third of the ground is underwater, and wherever water collects, it takes things with it, mobile nutrients, and affects how the crop grows and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, all land has variability. There's no question about that.
Yeah. So that's not honestly, at this point, that's not even a topic of conversation. We're not debating whether or not land or a field, take one field, 160 acres, has got variability. You're saying every field, whether it's 3-inch of topography change in the Red River Valley, you're still seeing some change in that landscape.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, we're in those land types. Definitely, it comes down to a water thing, right? If you look at a yield map in a wet year, well, what all the places that collect water, the crop is dead, right? And in a dry year, where those are the highest yielding parts of the field. So clearly, it's not so much land variability. It's everything's driven by water. We're talking about salinity today. Well, that's you have to understand where the water is and why and where it's going and where it's coming from to understand salinity. So water drives everything, and that's we're sort of jumping into our topic now.
Yeah, so that's a good lead in here. So we understand variability is real, and our topic today, salinity and alkalinity, and the challenges we face. The question I'm going to pose to you is it in fact, is it a soil structural issue, or is it actually a water issue that we're dealing with here on a broad-based scale?
Well, I guess, the dominant factor is water, right? The water and the parent material. So you can have water problems without salinity problems if your parent material and the groundwater does not have any salts in it, but that's not typically the case. Like most of the parent material has some type of salt content, and whatever is dissolved in that and is in your parent material, as your water moves around, that's going to be expressed somewhere in the landscape, right? So yeah, it's definitely water related. Of course, if you don't have the water has no ability to come up, or water has no ability to leach or come down, that sort of structure side is going to also have an effect, but that's more localized in the specific types of soils you're in.
Yeah. So part of your process in with CropPro is actually, I guess you tell me, but EC mapping, electrical conductivity mapping, is one of the tools. When we start getting into this definition of basically saying there is some zones in a field that are basically under stress or pressure, and then when we peel it all back, we identify what the real issue is. But what are some of the tools that you're using to actually create that definition inside of a field to get to a point of saying, hey, you know what, this is saline, and this isn't saline, but this has some sodium or sodic issues?
Yeah, well, since we started, we've had some type of a EM or EC based device always to measure soil properties, and whether it was Veris, Topsoil Mapper, or EM38, those are the three machines that we've dealt with extensively. They all basically are making the same map, and it's dominated by texture, water, and the solutes dissolved in water. And so, in probably 80% of the field, the texture and water related effects will, be the things that pop out on the maps. But whenever you have salinity, then, the numbers might go from in that 0 to 100 range to all of a sudden you're into the 300s and 400s. So it pops right off the charts. And then you see that gradient, of course, once you start passing through the 100s to the 400s and stuff like that. Now, we don't use the actual raw data numbers, so I just threw those numbers out, but we generally, what I'd call is we normalize it just to get a range of numbers, maybe between 0 and 4. And that just takes out what you'd call the annual temporal variability that's created by wet year versus dry year and that type of thing.
Yeah. So you map a field, it shows you the definition of change, based on those parameters that you talked about, but then you are actually soil testing.
Correct. Yeah. So
yes.
Yeah. So on a typical field, you'll have, usually it's low electrical conductivity in the hills. Water is shedding there. They're drier. They're generally the coarser textured parts of the field. So they'll have low EC. And then as you go down the mid slopes, it'll start to collect more water and more solutes that are dissolved in water. And typically it's the depressions then that have higher water content and higher solute content. And then, so I just described not only the EC layers, but also that, this topography gradient, right? Hills have thinner topsoils and lower organic matter. The depressions typically have higher organic matter and thicker topsoils. So we would go and soil test all those hills together as a zone and say, out of a 160 acre field, there's 10 acres of hills and those all go into one bucket. And on the other end, the extremes that we're talking about today, the areas that collect water, have high groundwater, they could be flooded depressions, or they could be well-drained depressions, or they could be saline areas. And so anytime there's salinity, we put that all into one zone. Yeah, and then that would go into, we would soil test that. So we don't use the actual readings off the devices to define what's the salinity of the area. We actually do a lab test for EC. That just keeps it consistent. Otherwise, you don't, this influence of water and texture all the time, messing things up. And unless you actually get a, way to validate exactly what is this number, that's not influenced by these temporal things.
Gotcha. Yeah. So when we piece this all together, you're actually using a multitude of factors, including topography, in this equation to actually get down to this definition of saying, this particular area, this is exactly what we're dealing with here. And then you can take it one step further and say, yes, the soluble salts are actually quite high here, but the sodium concentration is low, or it has low soluble salts, but this particular zone that isn't producing actually has really high sodium. The parts per million are high. The percentage of sodium in the base is actually sitting at 4%. You can get to that level of definition with the way you take this all the way through.
Yeah, and of course, like when you map a field, you don't know that. All you have is this map that shows you areas that are high, areas that are low. So it is the soil testing, it is the agronomists going out there and identifying these areas and specifically soil testing them and getting a, chemical analysis to say, what are we dealing with here? Do we have sodium? Do we not? Or what's the EC of this area, so that we have an idea what we're dealing with. And lots of times in the field, like the farmer doesn't always 100% know, is this area just wet and flooded, or is it saline, right? And so you're not going to manage everything the same. Like saline areas will never be productive. Wet areas, you don't abandon them like you would a saline area in terms of, fertilizing it for a high yield type of thing. So you got to differentiate those things.
Yeah. Leading into this podcast, actually, Mike Dolinsky, who is working with us in Taurus, he's feeding me articles and papers on this from around the world, and he sent me one as like a 20-page document, but it actually had in there some statistics of world production, and it estimated that 100, if you can believe this or not, it estimated that 1 billion hectares, or call it 2.2 million acres, 2.2 billion acres in the world are affected by salinity. And there's roughly, it also goes on to state that there's roughly, 20 to 46 million hectares, or call it 100 million acres, that are actually still producing, but are still losing production because of background levels of salinity or sodic natures of soil. So and it also estimates that it's growing on average every year. Upwards of 3 to 5 million acres a year are growing in the productive areas of agriculture. So it's not going away, and it's a huge thing. And yet here we are in Western Canada, and you've spent the last 17 years actually defining this down to actually impact areas within a field, which to me is like, we're like, when you think of it like that, it's like we're light years ahead, of the understanding that we actually have, which kind of leads us to this next, thought process is, okay, you've done a tremendous job. You have the definition, you've defined whether it's saline or alkaline, whether it's actually just a water issue, caused from ponding with the 6-inch rain that we got in June or whatever. The question we get is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it if it's impacting, call it billions of acres in the world and call it significant acres here in Western Canada? What are we going to do about it? And it bases the acres you touch, Cory. What percentage of the acres do you think are currently affected with some level of salinity or alkalinity that's actually affecting production?
Of the acres that we would have mapped, I guess, I like to use this number of 5%. It's a real easy number, but it's probably sort of in that range to 5 to 10% in a general context.
Sorry, I'll just probably 5. That's 5 to 10% that actually you'd call, on a scale of 0 to 50 bushels, that would be 0 to 10 bushels, kind of. Is that? Sorry, I'm just trying to put it in context, but that are not productive at all.
Yeah, I guess you could put it this way: there's 1 million acres, 50,000 of it would be basically very, very low productivity from a crop standpoint.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you get something growing there, maybe get a little bit of something. And another 50,000 acres would have what I call light salinity, where management can have a, really important effect, and people can actually do reasonably well farming through that stuff. So, but it's very regional, right? That you'll go into some areas where it's basically 0. And in the area where we work here, this is the Quill Lakes watershed. It's a well-known watershed with massive water and salinity problems. It's upwards to 15% on average on a person's farm. So a 10,000 acre farmer would have 1,500 acres that he's dealing with. So, but on leading into this, you said, Western Canada, we have done a lot, right? In the past 20 years, the move to continuous cropping and zero till, right? That's increased water use efficiency. So it's helped to lower the issues with high groundwater tables and evaporation. We've already taken a massive improvement that we don't really talk about anymore. So that is a very large thing that we've already done, that producers have done. And I don't see, even in the 12 years that I've worked here, salinity isn't getting worse in Western Canada. It's stable to similar to our conversation here today. There's lots of great farm managers out there dealing with salinity and trying to, recover acres and make them more productive.
Yeah. So that was a question I had for you. You're seeing an improvement, but you're also seeing that desire to actually try to make a field better by taking, call it, maybe not the worst part of the field, but taking something that's slightly affected and trying to figure out how to improve production or plant growth in that area.
Oh, absolutely. That's been, once those areas are defined, then producers immediately switch to how can we manage them, because until you have a variable rate drill for seed and fertilizer, up till then, what can you do? You're farming through it, right? So as soon as we start to build maps, that it immediately turns to, okay, well, those areas are super high fertility. Let's, wipe most of the fertilizer, if not all, from them, and let's remove fertilizer from the seed row. Let's, maybe increase our seed rate on barley and wheat and oats and crops that, we could use more water and get something growing and compete with weeds. And so, yeah, as soon as you define that you have specific areas, then management and their desire to manage it goes up exponentially.
Yeah. So in a simplistic view, the first step on the road to recovery is actually definition. Would that be fair analysis?
Yeah, I think so. If a farmer knows his own land pretty well, he obviously knows where he can drive with a piece of equipment and go and do something. But, that doesn't mean that he has the ability to apply nutrients and seed and stuff at different rates or manage his own costs and other things. So, yeah, you need a map. Otherwise, you can't do anything with a piece of equipment by prescription.
All right. Hey, we got a question here, Cory. I'll pose it to you. It kind of relates to this definition mindset. Will the same zones based on the EC have the same chemical analysis, or can you have, for example, 2 yellow zones with different soil chemical results?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's part of the reason why we don't use EC on its own. So, I can give an example of the field that I'm on right here in my home quarter. Is the tops of the hills are eroded knolls, and they'll have a exact same EC as my depressions, because the eroded knolls, the topsoil is gone, they have a high clay content, high lime content, and then you go down to the depressions and they're high in water and high in gypsum, and they'll have the same EC. So yeah, the answer is yes. You need topography, you need water models to define different ECs and why they are the way they are. So yeah, they can have different chemical results, yes.
Yeah, which is basically the soil test, essentially.
Well, yeah, but you have to get them separated. Like on an EC map, they're the same color, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we build it into a SWOT map, where it's like we can turn that eroded knoll into a zone 1 and say, well, yeah, it's a high EC for a different reason. And we can turn some salinity that's at the high groundwater table in a depression into a zone 10. Maybe they have the same EC number, but then when you go out and soil test them, you are going to get 2 different chemical results, right? The top of the hill is going to have no sulfur, no sulfates in the soil test. The depression is going to be loaded with sulfates. So yeah, that's why you can't use an EC map on its own to build zones. It's a perfect example.
Gotcha. Perfect. So topography comes into that equation.
Topography, which is essentially modeling water, right? Like topography is, it defines some things, of course, but yeah, it's the water modeling component of the topography. That's the key thing there. Yep.
Okay, perfect. That's the answer we were looking for. So we got into this conversation. So you're seeing this movement with the definition. Growers have this desire to actually say, what can we do? We don't like the fact that 5% of our field is producing nothing, or there's this, 5 to 10% or 5 to 15% of the field that is actually lower producing. What are some of the strategies that you're seeing employed that are actually showing some success?
Well, in general, of course, people are hiring us because they want to do variable rate fertilizer and seed. And the first thing you'll notice is that when you soil sample areas with salinity, is they're loaded with nutrients, right? They'll be the highest testing in sulfates, usually the highest in chlorides, highest in nitrogen. They'll probably have accumulations of phosphate because, water from leachate is leaching out of the straw, moving to those areas, plus traditional topsoil erosion down to those areas type of thing. So they're loaded with nutrients, so it's not a fertility problem, and there's no productivity. So the first thing everyone does is cut their fertilizer. Right? There's not going to be any response to fertilizer down there. Matter of fact, fertilizing, it's hurting you. So that would be the number one thing they do. The second thing is deciding whether or not increasing the seed rate is something that they want to do. Okay, that's an easy thing to do, and it's very common with barley, wheat, and oats I mentioned in Western Canada. With canola, it's a little trickier because it's, $100 an acre for seed now. So not everyone's trying to use more water and establish more crop in those areas. But that's probably the two most common things people do. And then their mind then would switch to like drainage, right? Because salinity problems are a water problem. How can we reduce water accumulation in the landscape? So surface water drainage, of course, would be the next thing. That would be number one on most people's list. And then once they're done with that, then you move on to other things, which I say most people are just getting started in, whether that's tile drainage or use of different crop types or, varietal selection, things like that.
Yeah. Do you think the price of land has an impact on the desire to make a change or look for ways to actually increase productivity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it goes twofold, right? Like, as the price of land keeps rising, it gets harder to buy land. And so people will make improvements on the land base that they have and just say, I'm going to take this 10% of my acres and try and get those more productive and not increase acres I'm farming. And conversely, lots of people make land improvements and, the value of the land goes up that they improve. So, yeah, as time goes on, tile drainage now is a thing here in Saskatchewan, like it wasn't 5 years ago. Now there's tile plows going all over the place, right? So, absolutely, as the land value goes up, people keep trying to make it more and more productive, and that making it more productive makes it more valuable again, and so, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a mindset, right? I would say the fall of 2019, with crops in the field late, there wasn't a lot of field work done, but I would argue the fall of 2020, the last 6 weeks driving across the country, you'd say there's been a lot of, call it, if you talk about water management, but in the area of surface drainage, that there's been a lot of that type of work done here this past few weeks from what I've seen. But that's growers basically trying to figure out how to improve the acres they have, right? And I don't know the number. I don't know where that breaking point is, but let's face it, if we're sitting here today and canola's $12 a bushel and peas are $8 or $9, and I got to believe the desire to pursue success isn't going away, and whether that's in more acres or making your acres better, I would argue we're already at that tipping point where we need to focus on trying to make our acres we have better, and you're telling us that it can be done, right?
Yeah, and I guess, and I think pretty much all farmers know this, it's like the light salinity issues, you can have a lot of success there, right? Like investing in different things is likely to bring success. It's when you have severe salinity, right? If there's just no way that you can manage the groundwater related issues or however your salinity is coming in, if it's artesian pressure or, recharge areas from highway ditches or sloughs and stuff like that, bathtub rings, like sometimes you can't fix it. Like, you need to be super careful. And so the light salinity, I think, yes, there's lots of opportunity to make slow, steady changes in those areas. But on the severe salinity stuff, you can sink a lot of money in there. And, if you can't fix the groundwater problems, temporary little fixes aren't going to help you that much. So they do have to be careful, I guess.
Yeah. What do you see? We talk about salinity, which basically encompasses, all the ions that we would actually see in salinity, from chlorides to sulfates to magnesium sulfates, but that also includes sodium. And how often do you see this definition between, yes, it's saline, or kind of here we're dealing with a sodium issue specifically?
Yeah, like in Western Canada, there's not a lot of what you'd call true sodic soils, like where sodium is the only ion causing the problems. We tend to have saline, which is, your typical salts, or saline sodic, which is your typical salts plus sodium. Don't have a lot of true sodic soils. And those are pretty well mapped out already. And of course, wherever people have those sodic soils, they also have some of the hard pan related structural issues. So because you have a combination of the hard pans and the sodium and the high salt content, it all shows up on maps pretty well. So that just makes it even harder, I guess, to manage, because not only do you have just the water plus the salt problem, now you have your structural issue too that you're dealing with there. So
right.
It's small defined areas, of course, across Western Canada that have those specific types of soils.
Yeah. So in our case, and I agree with you, a lot of what we see when we talk sodium, we're talking saline sodic, essentially, right? Where sodium is part of the salinity issue, one of the ions that's causing problems, but then it tends to cause its own problems as far as soil structural issues, right? It kind of makes, sodium's kind of like magnesium. It's a very small molecule. And if it becomes in high abundance and it's occupying the soil shelves, then you create the soil that has trouble with water, right? It can't take on water because you lose all your structure. So you don't get very good water infiltration. And when that happens, you can't grow a plant if you have no structure in your soil, right? And that it could lead us into a whole other podcast around, soil health, essentially, right? This is a growing movement to, going the other way and saying, geez, if we want to have healthy plants, what comes first, healthy soil or healthy plants? Well, you got to have a healthy plant to actually make a healthy soil, biologically speaking, right? You can't have good biology without a plant. And that's part of the challenge with some of these areas, is that if plant growth has been limited, you really haven't done a good job of feeding the biology of the soil over however many years that's, taken place, right? And so that's where, say, what's the first step? Where do we start here? Maybe it's a soil structural play, especially if sodium's part of the salinity, that we got to figure out how to address that or get that out of the equation. And I don't know if we can get there without addressing the water table, right? So it's like this, we live in this, call it the chicken and egg syndrome. What comes first? Yeah. We ourselves as Taurus, in this sector, and I'm with Cory. I believe the definition is absolutely critical, but we're there. We're there. We're talking, Cory being one of the founding fathers of variable rate and field definition in Western Canada. Call it, we're 20 years into this now. Having that ability to define and then say, what are we going to do about it? One of the things we look at is if it's a sodium issue in other parts of the world, we know gypsum is actually a tool that's being used to actually displace that ion on the soil shelf. Obviously, if I look at, say, molecule size, so this is like the size of magnesium or sodium. This is the size of a calcium molecule. If you put these in the soil and displace these, you actually increase pore space and water infiltration. You also knock some of that off the shelf. And if you got a place for it to go, then you can actually establish a plant. Once you have a plant, then you have a chance to actually draw down that water table. And so Cory says, a crop like barley, I'd even argue actually canola, I find, can do not too bad in areas with moderate levels of salinity or background levels of sodium. Would you agree or disagree with me on that one?
Yeah, I guess I don't get too excited about that. I think most people would know the crop types do well in the type of salts and the water related issues that they have in their area. And like barley, I always find it an interesting one because when you read the tables, it's all like barley. Well, here in the Quill Lake system, where the salts are associated with like so much water, barley sucks. Like it floods out. Like it doesn't have flooding tolerance. So you have to, consider what is your problem. You have a water and a salt problem. Well, barley isn't actually that good. I think you posed a lot of different ideas there, and like the idea of soil health and getting the crop established. Yeah, it's very important. Those saline areas, they can become just dead, right? Biologically, they're dead. So, yeah, and you can't get crops established there. There's lots of issues. And so really one of the things to consider is we always say, seed them to something else. I say, well, that's easy if it's like on the edge of a field or something, or along the ditch, but when it's 50 spots all spread throughout your field, it's not easy to do that, right? Jumping then to your comment on the sodium and stuff. Yeah, gypsum is well known as like, it will displace sodium, but then you need to leach the sodium. So if you're in a wet climate or you're under irrigation and you've got somewhere for the water to go, well, that's great. That'll work. Yes. But in Western Canada, how long is it going to take to leach it out? Like you go down to Weyburn, that's where a lot of our sodium problems are. It's dry, right? Like it's lentil country. So, and down there, that was sort of the birthplace of doing deep ripping and all these things. And a lot of those things, what people need to be careful of is this temporary or is this permanent? You can spend thousands of dollars an acre on something, but if it only helps for a few years and then it goes back to the way it wasn't worth it, right? So, and same thing with tiling in those sodium soils. People have to be super careful because you mentioned it, like the soil particles disperse, they're going to smear, and what happens if you lay tile in something like that? It's going to plug the tile off, or is tile even going to work if you don't get water through a hard pan smeared soil structure? So yeah, it's pretty tricky, pretty local, right? Like these things we're talking about it's complex, lots of things going on. And you get on Twitter and it's like people just talk about them as if they're all the same. And you can see people from all different geographies and regions and different salt type problems. And some people have acid soils and some people have high pH soils, and they're all looking for a one-shot solution. Well, it doesn't work, right? Every specific region has different water and salt types and different management practices that are going to work and not work.
Yeah, I think that's one thing in our society. It's easy to broadband things with a brush, right, and say this is the solution, and yet part of our conversation here today is really talking about the definition and being specific to that field or that area or that grower, and what are some of the solutions that we need to employ. And honestly, I'm with you. It's a multifaceted approach to get to some level of change, essentially, and then you got to figure out, is that change actually economic or not? Like, can we actually pursue not just success, but success from a profitability perspective, right? I mean, we know, and I'm with you, we probably don't need to spend any more money on fertilizer if these areas are loaded, right? But you got to figure out how to establish a healthy plant. If you don't have a healthy plant, it'll never use that fertility that's there. And in a lot of cases, our main issue is that these plants end up dying of drought stress. Even though we're not short of water in those areas, it's actually, the salt gradient the osmotic effect is so great that they just can't actually access the water that's there. And that's what usually causes the lack of plant growth. So we do have a question here. Is it possible to change the structural problem by applying calcium or gypsum, or is it just not going to happen? I've recommended a lot of calcium without restoring the structure. That's a good question. And I think that Cory kind of alluded to it. I think if that's your only approach without trying to figure out if we can address the movement of a place for some of these salts to go, there's no question calcium's used successfully around the world. I mean, we have a product ourselves in our portfolio called Sulfur Plus, which is synthetic gypsum that we're currently using with great success in Western Canada. A lot of cases as a calcium source where they're low in calcium. It's also a sulfur source, but we're seeing some effects as an amendment. Part of our reasoning is because we can actually put it in a seed row. Most gypsum products in the market are broadcast. You can't handle them through our Western Canadian air seeders. Whereas we're trying to concentrate, call it 100 or 200 pounds in the seed row, and saying, you know what, I don't think we can change the soil, but maybe in that seed row environment, because we have a granule that you can handle, you can actually, for a period of time, alter the environment for that seedling or for the plant. And if you can get it established, growing roots, then you have a chance to actually use some nutrition and use some of that water. And does it change the soil in forever? And I'd say no, because I mean, you're talking about a 2,000-pound gorilla that is going to fight its way back, like Cory said. But maybe if we can get some plant established on an annual basis, you have a fighting chance to use water. You have a fighting chance to actually use some nutrition. And some of that nutrition actually is probably also part of the issue on the salinity side of it too. We've fed some salinity over these years where we've added nutrition or nutrients, but no usage. And so it's one tool, but it's part of an overall strategy, which could also include either surface drainage or at some point, maybe even to the point of tile. And I followed or looked at a presentation done by Les Henry in 2010 here the other day, and it was really good. I really enjoyed it. But Les said even then, basis his experience, especially dealing with displacing sodium, it's a two-part. You gotta have a place for it to go, but you have to use something like a gypsum to displace the sodium off the soil shelf. And I agree with Les. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to do here is, maybe on a micro scale in a seed row or a band, but maybe not necessarily across the broad spectrum of, 2 million pounds of soil, because that's really tough to, you're talking tons and tons of material, and you still may not win. It still may fight its way back. So yeah, that's a long answer to a short question, but yeah, I mean, maybe gypsum in a broad base, it's hard to change the soil, but in our world, we're saying maybe in a microsite effect in a seed row, we can have some, annual effects to actually get plants growing or established.
Yeah, to add to that, the user said, can't achieve restoring the structure. Well, if you have those prismatic columnar structures out there, you can add a lot of calcium and you're not going to bust that up, right? It's like a massively compacted soil structure. So you are going to have to physically bust those or bust them with roots or, that's a slow process to changing that. So I think that's probably the big thing is just to patience with these things. And I like what you mentioned about the soil amendments, and we need to, I like that of getting just helping the crops to get established. And once they get going, maybe they can use water, maybe they can add some biology to the soil. Slowly we can start recovering those areas with a micro soil amendment approach. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's, and we're going to enter this phase, and Cory's well aware of it too, with this customer base and people that we deal with across the broad market is, soil health is not going to go away, because I believe in it too, but it's a consumer story that consumers are kind of they like it, even though they don't understand the science behind it all. They like the idea of talking about soil health. And yet, in all reality, in our world, what we truly need to talk about is plant health. Right? If we can make healthy plants, we have a fighting chance to make healthy soil. And I think Cory would agree that, he could go to any one of his fields that has been mapped for the last 17 years and tell us where the most productive area of that field is. And I would argue, if we looked at the biology in that area, that will have the best biology. Like, it'll have the best soil health because it's always growing the most productive plants. So there's a correlation there, and that's something that we probably are lacking or missing in these areas that haven't really produced a lot of plant material, over the years. And it kind of leads to this question here, do you know of any specific soil health strategies that have shown some potential success in salinity without drainage? It's kind of funny, I'll throw this out here, but as crazy as it sounds, something like kochia, it's a plant that's growing using water, and we hate it. It's a bad weed in the marketplace. Do you see that as a strategy or as a hindrance?
Well, I guess I'm more got my farmer hat on here. See, kochia is well, I don't know. I understand how it could be used, but no, I think there's lots of annual and perennial crops that we know, have a good establishment and can live in salinity, and I would focus more on using those, right? Like whether it's annual blends or, that type of thing. I'm not in love with kochia, but but you are right. There's the questions coming up here on other specific soil health strategies. I think that on the topic of soil health, like we are always treating the area where we see the problem, right? And we forget that, okay, well, why is it there? So if you don't have a high water table issue, you probably don't have a salt issue. So if people start to take a few steps back and saying, well, what can I do to, do a better job of managing water? If we start back, go way back, and in my field out here, it's a perfect example, is in the summer, the hills are drying up and I'm losing yield, and the depressions are always have a high water table, and the yield isn't the highest in those areas because they're too wet, right? And then I sit here and we're talking about drainage and the salt issue. Well, the reality is, how can we increase infiltration across the field? Let's keep the water on the hills. Let's keep the water on the mid slopes. Let's not drain the water, right? Like everybody in Western Canada is losing yield on their hills. But we don't talk about that. Like we just talk about how to spend $1 million on drainage equipment and dump it out the other end and get rid of it like it's worthless, when it's not the right solution. And same thing with managing these salt affected areas. I think that people have to get more into, okay, if I'm seeding through them, okay, yeah, we can reduce fertilizer and stuff, but no one talks about something that I've lobbied for years. We talk about canola and barley. Let's use wheat for an example. What's our most flood and saline tolerant wheat variety? Like, see, we don't know. Right? No, so we have 200 canola varieties, and we know what's best for the mid slopes in our zone, in our mid slope zones. Well, who cares? Like I've always said, out of 200 canola varieties, I want to know 1 or 2 or 3 that are saline and flood tolerant. And I can specifically seed those. I don't care if they yield 5 bushels an acre. If they establish and they compete with weeds and they do something, get a plant growing there, then you're doing something. And like the North Dakota State University has done lots of that work. They've done it with soybeans. They've done it with wheat, where they'll take all the existing varieties and just, do what we call screening, right? Screen them for flood and salinity tolerance. And then the producers know, these varieties are better than the other ones. So we can go and seed those. right? So there's other things that we can do that we don't even talk about. And I get really frustrated. It's like, well, let's increase the seeding rate of wheat. Well, if it's not a salt tolerant and salt and flood tolerant variety, it just dies anyway, right? Maybe some varieties aren't that way. So there's lots of things actually that we can do that we don't even talk about because they're not on our mindset, but we need to keep water in the field and not have it running downhill and, you know, recharging all our sloughs and depressions and leading to a high water table. We need to grow crops and varieties down there that are going to establish and compete with weeds. And even if there's no yield of something, there might as well be some annual crop growing in there that's salt and water tolerant. So you should be seeding something into there while you seed, whether it's through your drill or, you know, last year we did some drone seeding where we, you know, you could fly around a 10,000 acre farm and seed 500 acres with a drone in a few days, like spreading it on top of the ground before you, like, there's lots of things people could do. We don't think about them yet. They're very traditional in our mindset.
Yeah. It's like a light bulb moment for me when you actually mentioned managing water in a hilltop. You say, yeah, we're talking about salinity and the depressions and recharge areas, but you're right. A lot of it in our topography and our dryland farming is because the water isn't staying in certain areas, and then it causes loss of production in those areas, right? So it's, you know, what can we do in that area, you know, to save the water, you know, save the water in that area. And that's a whole other conversation, but it's like a light bulb moment for me right now to say, geez, that, you know, do a 180 here and say, geez, let's start having a conversation. What can we do there? So that's cool. I'm glad you brought that up. We are getting questions around PGPRs, you know, help plants establish in salt areas like salt tolerant grasses, you know, why not alfalfa? You know, Kim's asking. I agree, and those strategies are employed in work, especially I find here, like southwestern Manitoba, a lot of our salinity is, you see it from the road because it's along the road, right? It's like we created this impermeable layer of the natural flow of water in the ground by building a road and packing the clay, and then the salts stop right there. They can't get there, so you drive for a mile and you say, oh geez, that looks ugly, but it's because we created it. We created that impermeable layer. So there you say, fair enough, you know, maybe in that zone you take the first 100 feet from the road and you plant it to something that actually tolerates the salinity. And if you get plants established, then maybe you can actually, you know, move the water table and then get a crop in there like barley right behind it or something like that. So I agree that, but that still requires definition because you're taking growers that are farming thousands of acres and now you're going to say, let's take this 10 or 15 acres along the road and do something different. And a lot of times logistically growers don't like doing that, though it could be part of a solution, right? Yep. I had the question, and I was going to bring this up, and this is one other thing we're involved in, is there is a growing belief, and this is, you know, from the scientific community, and this goes back to the soil health, and we're involved in it too. But, you know, using an organism like mycorrhizae to actually help plants navigate water utilization and mitigation of salt stress. And actually, Mike sent me this article. It's a 20-page document on mycorrhizal effects and salinity. And it's not proven, but, you know, there's definitely work going into that area. I had the question, you know, does kochia colonize mycorrhizae? I don't know that answer. I believe it does. And maybe that's partly why kochia and foxtail barley actually do better in higher saline areas, because they are potential good hosts for mycorrhizal fungus. But we'll look into that and get that answer to you. But that definitely is in the world of using biology to actually help us. You know, it's kind of funny because we're talking about trying to come up with solutions in the course of farming this land over the last 60, 80, 100 years. And yet you take plants like kochia or foxtail barley or organisms like mycorrhizae, you could argue they've been around trying to figure out salinity since the beginning of time. Right? They got a few million years head start on us on trying to figure out how to adapt in the environment that they're presented. And so I say there's something that we can learn from nature. I mean, nature, sometimes we're trying to outsmart nature, but in all reality, sometimes we got to take a step back and look at plants and say, how are they doing it? How is kochia doing it in that area? What has it done to adapt itself to be able to grow in that environment where we take an annual crop like Cory says, like a wheat, and it can't, or a soybean, and it can't. So what can we learn from nature and plants themselves? And that's why I say maybe we do need to look closer at things like mycorrhizae, and I would say the scientific community they are looking at it and saying, is it a biological tool that we could use to actually help some of these plants establish?
So we've done lots of like the respiration tests. So the most common one people know is Solvita, right, where they're measuring respiration of the soil. The thought was always to use it as a nitrogen mineralization tool to see what the bugs are, how much microbial activity you have. But one thing we find with those saline soils is that there's very low respiration.
Yeah.
Right. So it's good always to think when you look at PGPR, well, that's fine. But if it's any type of microbial or bacterial species community that's not, it's like they're like crops too. Like they don't survive. There's very specific ones that are going to survive in a saline environment. So like in general, if you're just putting something out of a bag or a jug, expecting it to help you in the salinity, I would say it's probably not a great idea. Unless you've defined that this thing's going to survive there, it's no different than seeding a certain crop type. You need to know. And on the foxtail barley topic, because I've worked in lots of this land with foxtail barley, and yes, it'll colonize those areas. But what I find with foxtail and a lot of those salt-tolerant weeds is that they have a lot of allelopathy, right? Like if you don't get rid of foxtail, you can't establish some other type of crop.
Right.
So you've got to be pretty kind of careful with those sort of strategies, and it's not some of nature's things that survive in nature, like in a field situation. Like if you go into nature, it's not dominated by foxtail barley and kochia. That's only in the crop production nature, right? And so it has different ways that it's adapted, but that doesn't mean that it's good, in my opinion. That's why I say I don't like kochia, I don't like foxtail barley, I don't like those as things to use to manage salinity, because they've learned to manage salinity so they can be weeds in our crop system. So I'm not a lover of those.
Yeah, it's the survival of the fittest, essentially, and they've learned to adapt in a kind of, call it a monoculture environment very well, where other crops can't, right? But I'm saying, I'm with you. I'm not sure we want to use it as a tool, but what can we learn from how they adapted? What can we learn from what made them successful, essentially? And even to a point, you're saying allelopathy, they've even got one more defense mechanism to block everything else from coming in, right? So, which is kind of cool when you think of it from a plant perspective. We're getting to the end of our time here, Cory. I had this question around fertilization versus remediation, but I'm kind of looking at it from a world stage, and yet I could argue, basis what we just talked about in the last hour, we've probably, we think of remediation. I was thinking more like the eastern U.S. They do lots of liming because they have low pH soils. That's one way they make them more productive. Here, we're dealing with more background levels of salinity due to water issues, which is more a higher pH. But I think we spent the last hour actually talking about remediation strategies that is multifaceted. It's not a one-dimensional approach. There's a number of tools that we have at our fingertips, and it's enlightening. I'd say if we use them collectively, I think there's an opportunity to actually, claw our way back in some of these areas, right? Maybe not the dead, but the transitionary areas is probably where we would start. Would you agree with that thought process?
Yeah, the transition areas, like all these little things that people can start to do, definitely help them to make slow continual process or progress. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's good. So to sum it up, obviously definition is imperative, identifying the areas that we could address, employing strategies from surface drainage to trying to establish crops. You employ higher seeding rates to try to get some plant establishment in those areas. We talk about, depending on the complexity of the salinity, whether there's some sodium in it, we were saying seed applying calcium sulfate in a tight band can change the complexity of the soil, the structure, as a tool to help plants establish. And then we get into this whole idea of soil health, and that only comes with plant health. We can't get there we can't have healthy soil unless you have plants feeding carbon into the soil to create healthy biology. So, tile definitely is something that is happening and been utilized around the world for hundreds of years, actually, but it's a cost thing. So price of land, and I say we're here now. I mean, $12 canola growers will spend what they have to get the quarter beside them if they want it, but they don't like the idea that there's 5% or 10% of it that's not productive. And I think we're going to see this movement of trying to employ strategies to improve that area, or areas of the field that aren't producing like they could. So it's a battle, but I think it's one that we're prepared to take part in and help where we can. Still comes down to economics, right? Don't do it if it can't make you $1. You got to figure out how to get to a point of profitability. So with that, any other closing thoughts or comments you'd have, Cory?
No, I don't think so, I guess. Thank you very much for having me today. It was fun.
Yeah.
Everyone learned a little something, and yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I appreciate your insight and your input, and hopefully, the audience that took part can take something home. There is a couple more questions that I'll maybe just throw out there quickly. Leaving cattail sloughs and tree lines alone to help manage water levels. Is that a thought? And I said maybe cattails are plants that are growing. Tree lines definitely are probably accessing water to lower the water table. It's maybe not a bad strategy. Thoughts there, Cory?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because I would say, again, that's like very region specific, right? So sometimes, I'll use tree lines as an example. If it fills up with 3 feet of snow and takes an extra 2 weeks for the water to all leave them, and it's actually adding to your water levels, and all the snow blew off and into the creeks. So that's a tricky one. And if there's like potholes all throughout the whole entire field, like those fill with water, that keeps the water table up. And around every single pothole, you can have a recharge and a discharge area. But on the other hand, yeah, they do use more water. Obviously, cattails, sloughs, and trees use a heck of a lot more water than a wheat or barley plant. So that's a tricky question because it's very regional specific. Like in some regions it'll help, in others it won't.
Yeah. Okay. Just to close, you want to list your website. People want more information on your business and reach out to you. What's your website, Cory?
Sure, yeah, we have CropPro.ca. That's our local agronomy website. And then for all our partners and technology, it's swapmaps.com.
Okay, perfect. This presentation is being recorded, so I do know that I had a few texts where people couldn't get on as we were full. We had more people subscribed than we had space in our podcast this morning, but so it is recorded. We will post this or send it out. You can go to our website as well, taurus.ag, and find this podcast, and we'll send it over to Cory too, so he can post it on his website too. So thanks for coming on, and enjoyed the time, Cory, and the conversation, and I'm sure, like always, it'll spawn more questions, that's the business we're in, is you find an answer and you create two more questions. So it's that's the whole point of it. So anyway, thanks again.
Thank you.
Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.